And we're back with a new episode of Talking with Doyle. I'm Hunter Kipe, and of course I'm joined with Representative Doyle Heffley, and we have a special guest today, Representative Jason Ortitay, who represents parts of Allegheny and parts of Washington counties. So Doyle, what are we talking about today?
Today we are going to be talking a little bit about parental rights and behavioral health services. Obviously, one of the big things that we hear about right now is behavioral health, and how do we make sure that folks that need help are going to get access to care. So recently, the administration, the Department of Health, came out with regulations that deal with access to care for children, and these are children between the ages of 14 and 18. And it really parallels legislation that we passed a few years ago to create in statute a way that children that are 14 to 18 years old can access care, but our legislation also preserved parental rights. And Representative Ortitay championed that legislation. It was passed in the House, and now we have an administration that just pretty much threw out the statute and created the regulations, which are in direct violation of Commonwealth law.
Yeah, I mean, it really does contradict what we passed in 2020. And there was a lot of work that went into that. It took 6 years. We passed the House, I think, 3 consecutive sessions unanimously. The Senate held it up. And then finally at the end, with the help of then Secretary Levine and Senator Baker, we were able to finally get it signed into law. And again, it was a unanimous vote. The Governor Wolf signed it into law. But since 2020, we've had so many problems getting the department to issue guidance because there's been so much confusion all over the state as to what parental rights is and what the rights of what the minors can actually consent to. There's a lot of confusion. I was getting calls from all over the state saying, hey, this facility refuses to treat my kid without their consent. I'm like, well, that's not the law. And then we've had some horror stories. We've had some unfortunate suicides. And in this case, with the program that the department wants to implement using this regulation, it's actually a good idea for the program, but it's in direct contradiction of state law. And if we're going to open this can of worms and you're going to be able just to write regulations to circumvent what the law actually says, that's not what the purpose of IRC is. And Doyle, I know we've had a lot of conversations about that over the last couple of weeks.
What this regulation changes, there's something called PRS, which are psychiatric rehabilitation services. And these are services like teach life skills and other things and helping folks that maybe they were in a facility and they're coming out, and this is kind of like the last phase in that process. So if a parent, maybe they're looking at their child and identifying they're still struggling with some things, and you want to get them into these services, and a child says, I don't want to go. Just like when I was a kid, how many times I told my parents, I don't want to go to school, I don't want to get out of bed today, but you're going to school. So what this regulation does is it takes away the ability of the parent to say to the child, you need to go into these services, and then parents are coming back to us and say, well, why'd you pass that law? But that's not in the law, and it's in direct violation. In the statute, it said if somebody's between the ages of 14 and 18 and they have some concerns about their personal behavioral health, that child can go and talk to somebody and seek some help. But it doesn't circumvent the parental rights at all. What it does is it lets that child gain access to that care if they need it. But if a parent says, my child needs these services, and a child doesn't want to go, the parents still have that right. And the legislation preserved that. And this is a step down a very slippery slope. And we hear a lot about that. And when we look at the issues of today when it comes to behavioral health and some of the services that are out there and some of the services that are needed, you have to have that involvement of the parent. I don't know why the department would think that they can push that out or supersede the parental consent, especially because it was very specific in statute. And this bill was debated for 3 sessions, many really thoughtful conversations, and it was tweaked so that the people's voice, which are the members of the State House and Senate, would have that say and pass legislation. And now for unelected bureaucrats to just overturn that through a regulation and not at all respect the authority of the legislature, it's a constitutional issue in our state constitution. We have 3 co-equal branches of government, and it really sets up a terrible precedent.
There's a couple things from that meeting that just really, irked me, and pun intended on that. They never reached out to me about this regulation at all. You would think that I think I'm one of the 3 co-prime sponsors of that bill. I'm the only one left. Representative Pam Snyder retired, Marsha Hahn retired. They all worked with me on this, didn't reach out to me a single time. And then during the meeting, the one lady said that she had talked to me. And I haven't had any conversations with them for almost 2 years, right before Christmas, when we were having conversations about updating the bulletin so people could actually accurately understand what Act 20 was.
So when did you ultimately end up finding out that this was happening? When did you know about the meeting?
So as these regulations come out, and departments are always coming out with regulations, Department of Health, Department of Ed, as these regulations come out, there's a process. So those regulations are rolled out. They gave them to us in very short notice. As those regulations come out and they put forth regulations, it then goes to IRC, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. It's a board of commissioners. I think there's 5 commissioners. And those commissioners then look at the regulations and say, do these regulations match the law, right? The statute, because that's what their responsibility is. So whether it's a Department of Health issue, it's a transportation, anything that any new regulation or guidance that comes out from the administration must go through this process. And then at the IRC, they had an IRC hearing, and it was Commissioner John Sirocco actually voted against it and said, look, even if you think this is a good idea, you still can't do it because it violates statute. So IRC reviews it. If they approve those regulations, it then will go to the Attorney General. The Attorney General will look over it, and that's the phase we're in now. And I know you had sent a letter to our acting Attorney General with concerns about this. Or the committee could actually take a vote and overturn the regulations. However, that has not, as a minority chair of the Human Service Committee, I can't call for that.
Yeah, it's been hard because I found out about a week before the hearing, the voting meeting actually, and that's when I put I think we had talked about doing a joint letter. You ended up doing one, I think, with your committee, and I said, as a prime sponsor, I should probably do one separately. So we did that. And Commissioner Sirocco actually brought it up, a lot of some of your letter, some of mine, during the actual voting meeting about why this doesn't work. It doesn't jive with current statute. And even another commissioner brought up a lot of the stuff that was in my letter. He ultimately voted for it. But still, yet at the end of the day, there were a lot of valid points brought up, and for it to go down on a 4-1 vote just seemed a little bit ridiculous. But I did follow up with the Attorney General with a letter saying that, hey, I don't believe that IRC has the authority, and this is what the Attorney General has the authority to basically strike this regulation down based on the legal precedent, not the policy. And we're going to go that route. We're going to try everything we can to get this this regulation out the door.
At the end of the day, you can look at the nuances of what their arguments were for and against, but it doesn't matter because they're violating statute. And at the end of the day, that's what we've seen repeatedly from this administration and the previous administration, whether it was overturning voting rights in the Commonwealth, whether it's putting forth regulations that don't match statute. They don't have the authority to supersede the legislature, and that's why this is so important. But fundamentally, this deals with parental rights. If your child is struggling like this, and maybe you want to get them into these services so they can get over that last hurdle, and then the child says, "Well, I don't want to go." Well, you're the parent saying, "No, you need to go." But what if something happens to that child then, or what if they take a step back in their treatment because of it? I mean, who are these bureaucrats to tell parents, in violation of state law, what they can and cannot do for their children? Well, and that fundamentally, to me, is wrong.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, and that was with the driving force behind, Act 20, which I called Gabby's Law. I had a constituent in my district who lost her daughter to suicide, who had a traumatic experience while she was in high school, followed by another series of traumatic experiences, which ultimately led to her suicide. And we said, well, what can we do? Like the school wasn't telling the mom anything. Anytime she tried to get her help, she would just say, no, I'm not going. And there was nothing legally she could do about it. And that's why we came up with this idea, was to say, listen, if you're between 14 and 17, then if the parent says you're going, then you're going. You're still a minor. They're still responsible for you. That's how this works. The original act in 2004, which we amended, is what you talked about, Doyle, is it gave the child the ability to consent to treatment. It didn't give them the ability to not consent. It didn't say that. It said if the parent is telling them, no, we don't want you to go, but you're saying yes, then you can go get the care that you need or you want at that point. But when we passed this in 2020, now we're saying that if the parent says between 14 and 17, you're still a minor, the parent says you're going, even if you don't consent. And that's what led to a lot of confusion amongst facilities across the state who are actually preventing parents from bringing their kids in. They're like, well, the kid's saying no, so by law, we don't have to take you, which led to 2 rounds of revisions in bulletins. And I know people are like, well, what's a bulletin? It's something that the state puts out to clarify acts and laws so that facilities understand how to actually implement this, and to have an actual clear guidelines on what is meant by this statute. And we still, to this day, have people misinterpreting. And now we're going to throw gas on the fire with the regulation that basically says, well, we don't need parental consent for this. And look, I understood the arguments they were making for this program. I'm all for mental health. I'm all for getting kids help all they want. All they had to do from the department was come to anybody in the legislature and say, look, this is what we want to do. Can we pass a statute or an exception and do this the route through the legislature? No, they didn't do any of that. And I don't think that I would have had a problem with it, and I don't think anyone in the House or Senate would have had a problem with it.
And how they got around it, how they explained to get around it, was they took these PRS services and they just classified them differently to say, well, it doesn't meet that because it's classified differently. But what's to say they can't do that for anything going forward? This bill was passed and signed by Governor Wolf.
Yeah.
So this is a bipartisan piece of legislation, and what the department's doing, it's wrong, and I commend you in your efforts to see this through, because if we cannot allow them to supersede statute.
We fought too hard. We fought way too hard to sit here and watch this happen. Not even 4 years later.
Yeah. So just for the public to know that parental rights are so key, and we don't need bureaucrats taking your parental rights away. That's what this really comes down to.